Alright, here's a hot take. Honkai Star Rail is not a turn-based game. You might immediately be thinking, what do you mean? It's right there on the tin of the game. But what if I told you it actually isn't? While Hoyo sometimes advertises their game as turn-based combat reimagined to get players in the door, they typically refer to the game as just a space fantasy RPG across all of their marketing.
From the makers of Genshin Impact comes an incredible space fantasy RPG.
Honkai Star Rail is a space fantasy RPG from Hoyoverse.
This is a brand new free-to-play RPG developed by Hoyoverse.
You might now be thinking, okay, but why does that matter? Hoyo can talk about their game however they want. But I think it's actually incredibly important for understanding the current state of the game. See, in actual turn-based games, the flow of combat generally goes back and forth. You take your turn, and then the enemy takes theirs. Whenever you're up for your turn, you're usually given options as to what to do, whether that's use an attack, use a skill from the variety that's available, use an item, or sometimes you even have the opportunity to just do nothing. On the other hand, in HSR, you've basically only got a couple of choices depending on the role of the character. Supports get to apply a buff, DPSs can attack, and that's pretty much it. That said, I do want to say that I don't just want to make this video about simple comparisons like how many buttons you can press or the fact that you can't use items in HSR, because I think it goes deeper than that. The actual problem is less about the lack of choices and more about the underlying mechanics that prevent those hypothetical choices from mattering in the first place. I really think what all this comes down to is speed and action advancing being core mechanics of the game. On paper, speed is fine. Like, turn-based RPGs have had speed as a stat for a very long time. Hell, even Pokemon, which has existed since the 90s, has speed to decide who attacks first when you enter a fight. On the other hand, it's become a problem in HSR because speed is an easily farmable stat for all of your characters rather than something they start with or can get through rare items, and there's also a plethora of action advances that stack on top of that speed. Both of these things are basically all-encompassing. Every bit of the game is catered around these two mechanics, and by making them easily accessible, this only feels more prominent. Think about it, right? Getting a pair of speed boosts, slapping it on a character, and then immediately getting a second action in a cycle because of that is a no-brainer, and there's usually not many reasons that you wouldn't want to do something like that. It affects every part of the game, from basic farming for your everyday casual player to the more arcadey gameplay like the simulated universe, and especially sustainless and zero-cycle runs. It begs the question, what's the point of any other mechanic when speed is more important than all of them? If an enemy is going to hit you, well, you can simply farm more speed so that the amount of times that they actually get to hit you is lowered. If you can't clear with one remaining cycle in MOC, well, time to start farming relic domains for those extra speed substats. And even then, you could supplement speed with something like DDD or a character action advance like we see with Bronya, Robin, and the like, and you'll be covered regardless. Honestly, a better question than what's the point of any other mechanic is there any room for a mechanic that adds extra choices to actually exist? For example, let's look at the idea of having a block button in the game. I've personally called this out as an option Hoyo has if they wanted to add more depth to combat, but if you honestly look at it, a button like that is almost completely irrelevant because what use is a block button if your unit has enough speed to take multiple actions in a cycle? I mean, why would you even want to use it? Instead, you can just kill the enemy before they hit you because you go before them, break the enemy and kill them before they have a chance to wake up by action delaying them so they never get to go, or even using an action advance to move past them in the action order. I'm sure we've all seen stuff at this point where you can have Robin use her skill, get action advanced by Bronya, and then Robin can activate her ultimate to action advance the entire team, which then lets you use Bronya's skill again to buff up your DPS. Obviously, you can't infinitely loop, but it does make me question what the point of a turn is in general if you can do stuff like that. Like, the entire principle of a turn-based game is this idea of you and the enemies basically trading blows with each other on each of your turns, but when you can do stuff like this to circumvent that structure, then it starts to get a bit confusing. Right, like, if not turns, then we need to identify what defines that structure for HSR. We can start by looking at cycles on the action order, or points in something like Pure Fiction. But really none of that is a true representation of what's going on behind the scenes. The most obvious peek behind the curtain has actually been in front of our faces for quite a while at this point, and that's the action value that you can see in Apocalyptic Shadow. You can think of it as a representation of how much sand you have left in an hourglass, or in other words, a timer. That timer that you see in Apocalyptic Shadow is basically the only thing that matters across all of the modes in this game. How much you can abuse it directly results in how fast or slow you can clear different stages, and the worst part is, in my opinion, Hoyo plays into it heavily. Like, all of the endgame is you versus a timer. Any team composition you make is completely dependent on how many actions your characters can get in a cycle, and this is why speed and action advances are so strong. You're not actually getting extra turns per se, you're just making it so that you get more actions before you run out of time. And this is an important distinction to make because currently it's not the back and forth between you and the enemy that determines who wins. It's how much speed you can get on your characters or how many action advances you can use versus how much speed Hoyo decides to give the enemy that decides the true outcome of these fights. As a result, it feels pretty obvious that Hoyo doesn't really have any interest in sticking to turn-based fundamentals, and all of this is why I just don't consider HSR to be a turn-based game anymore. To be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that's entirely a bad thing. Like, HSR doesn't have to be turn-based, it can be its own type of game. In fact, the Trails series games have very similar core mechanics to HSR, but those games don't suffer from the same issues because you're not limited to a timer. With that said, I think the manner in which Hoyo chose to be different by adding that timer hasn't done the game many favors in terms of creating different experiences or adding difficulty to it. And if they actually chose this path with the intention of doing that, then man did they miss the mark. I've talked a lot in my previous videos about how variety is what I want in this game first and foremost before anything else, but I've come to realize that variety only gives us more of what's already in the game, just with a different coat of paint. What I'd truly like to see are changes that add more depth to the game, or in other words, things that really shake up the formula. Whether that depth comes through difficult boss fights, or maybe our units having unique mechanics between each other rather than character A being stronger than character B, different skill buttons, or whatever else, it really doesn't matter, just that there are more things added to make combat feel different. Unfortunately, because speed is such a defining aspect of the game, I really am just leaning towards thinking that it's just not possible to get that kind of combat depth that I'd want without fundamental changes to how the game works. It makes me feel like so much potential nuance has been lost because you would always have to question the value of whatever potential mechanic could be added to the game. Our characters could have all of the different buttons that more traditional turn-based games have, like item usage in battle, a variety of skills, the ability to block or just do nothing, and it wouldn't matter because speed exists and therefore all of those things would be meaningless at best and extremely abusable at worst. Here's some examples. If you were able to use items, then that would result in people using action advances or building units with super high speed to spam the best ones. Even if the items were just okay, they could stack upon themselves, resulting in a group of buffs that would be extremely broken. Or on the other hand, if they were undertuned, then no one would use them anyway, making item usage pretty pointless. If you had multiple options for skills to use, then that could result in a chain where one unit could have a ton of speed and get multiple actions across the cycle to spam different buffs, some of which could potentially be even more action advances depending on the unit's kit, and then you would have a loop where one unit action advances another into another, and so on. If you could block like I mentioned earlier, it'd bring up the question of how you'd even be able to make use of it, because if you can use an action to block and you get another one before the enemy goes, then you just wasted your first action. Really, what I'm trying to point out here is that despite the fact that the game loosely follows the turn-based formula, the actual gameplay ends up more like an action game that has quick-time events, and the amount of events you get depends on a stat that you can increase or decrease at your own discretion. And because we can increase speed in that way, it really just limits so many different possibilities the game could have going forward. In a previous video, I've talked about how part of the reason power creep in this game exists is due to how much our units can do. But honestly, I think it's also because we can do so many things all within a short time frame. Like, think about it, if Super Break teams were slow, then that would remove the double dipping that niche has because they wouldn't be getting both action delays and a whole bunch of attacks while the enemy is delayed. If follow-up teams were at a slower speed threshold, then there would be less opportunity to take actions apart from their initial attack. If hypercarry teams didn't have the plethora of action advances that exist in the game, then there would need to be other things added to the game to actually make those units strong. If our characters had less actions in general, then that would mean less overall damage and therefore less reason for stuff like HP inflation to exist. On top of that, if we had less actions available, then the game wouldn't always need to be catered around a specific timer. Again, I don't necessarily think it's a problem that the game was designed in this way, but when you combine the ability to get a ton of speed on your characters with that timer, it creates some pitfalls when it comes to adding new things, and I think both Hoyo and the community, myself included, have fallen into those. On the player's end, it's really easy to just say, hey, add more stuff, I want more buttons to press. But if you think about it for a moment, there's just not really any way that Hoyo can do that because they've essentially designed themselves into a hole where there's no way to really expand the depth of it. I mean, even the summons that we'll see in 3.0, while cool, are most likely just going to be an extra unit on the field, which, while adding more variety, doesn't do much of anything else. Going forward, while I do want to see changes, I guess my outlook on all this is different now. It just doesn't really make sense anymore to think about adding something new when there's such a glaring problem with the way the current main mechanics interact with each other, and I feel like that interaction is kind of the root cause of a lot of the different problems the game has. Everything revolves around speed, action advances, and that timer. while I don't really expect this to fundamentally change going forward, I think it's important to talk about this so that people can better understand the pitfalls you can run into while discussing the possibilities of adding mechanics to the game in the future. What's your take on all this? Do you feel the same way about this that I do, or do you still think Hoyo has some avenues to shake things up in the future? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. As always, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe, join my Discord link down below if you want a place to hang out and chat, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.